The universe was dying, but it was doing so with a quiet and profound dignity. It was not a death of fire and cosmic violence, but one of slow, inexorable decay. A gentle exhalation that had begun eons ago. The scholars and poets of the elder races had named it the Great Rot, a term that was at once both clinical and poetic, for the affliction was a malaise of the soul as much as it was a physical law. Stars did not explode, they simply cooled, their light softening from a brilliant white to a tired amber, then a deep, bruised crimson before fading into the velvet blackness like embers sinking into ash. Worlds did not shatter, they crumbled, their mountains slumping into soft hills, their oceans thinning into dust-choked basins over silent millennia. Technology, too, succumbed to this universal lethargy. The great engines of the past, wonders that could fold space and weave light, now sputtered with exhaustion. Their power cores, once blazing with the fury of captured suns, now pulsed with the faint, rhythmic beat of a failing heart. To fight it was considered madness, a youthful folly. The rot was not an enemy to be conquered. It was the final, unchangeable state of being, the ultimate entropy toward which all things tended, and the most advanced civilizations had long ago abandoned the struggle and had instead turned their immense intellects toward perfecting the art of remembrance. They built archives, not armies. They composed elegies, not battle plans. And among them, the most respected figure was not a warrior or an emperor, but an archivist. Kalen was the last archivist of the Signian Compact, a coalition of species so ancient their origins were lost to their own histories. His body was long and slender, a being of pale light and woven bone, and his task was a sacred one to travel the fading star lanes and record the final moments of worlds, of species, of ideas. He did not preserve them, for preservation was a fight against the rot and therefore a fool's errand. He simply witnessed. He chronicled the gentle petrification of the crystalline forests on Alaris Prime, noting the exact hue of the setting sun as it cast its final, weary rays upon the silent, glass-like trees. He transcribed the final, whispered canticles of the void singers of the Orion Nebula, their song, a complex harmony that described the acceptance of oblivion, a melody that grew thinner and thinner until it was indistinguishable from the background radiation of space itself. He was a curator of endings, and he moved through the dying galaxy with a serene, melancholic grace. His ship, the Winter's Elegy, a silent shadow slipping between the cooling embers of civilization. His current vigil was over the planet designated Xylos, a world that had once been a jewel of the outer systems. The Xylans, a gentle insectoid race, had perfected a form of communal dreaming, their entire society linked in a shared consciousness that ebbed and flowed with the seasons. But the rot had seeped into their dreams, turning them sluggish and gray. Their grand, chitinous cities, once vibrant with the hum of shared thought, were now silent, the intricate carvings on their walls blurred by fine, rust-colored dust. Kalen watched from the sterile quiet of his observation deck as the last vestiges of the Xylan dream song faded from his sensitive instruments. It was a peaceful end, a collective sigh as an entire species chose to simply stop dreaming and accept the long sleep. Kalen made his final notations, his many-jointed fingers dancing over a holographic slate, his prose precise and unsentimental, yet imbued with a deep and abiding respect for the process he was witnessing. The end was not a tragedy. It was a completion. And then, something impossible happened. It was a flicker at first, a ghost in the data stream so subtle that Kalen almost dismissed it as a final spasm of the planet's dying energy grid. On the far side of Xylos, in a region known as the Whispering Canyons, a place that had been geologically inert for 100,000 years, A spike of energy bloomed. It was not a chaotic burst, not an explosion or a discharge. It was structured, patterned, and utterly alien. It was also, Kalen noted with a tremor that ran through his light-spun form, intensely, impossibly energetic. It was the energy signature of a system in its vibrant youth, not its final decay. He adjusted the elegy's orbital path, his three hearts beating with a rhythm they had not known for centuries, a discordant thrum of curiosity and a deep, instinctual dread. As his ship crested the horizon, he saw it. It was a vessel, but it was unlike any craft he had ever recorded. The ships of the known elder races were things of grace and sweeping lines, designed to slip through the void with a minimal disturbance, to resonate with the quiet hum of the dying universe. This thing was an insult to that design philosophy. It was a chaotic jumble of spheres, struts, and plates, asymmetrical and brutally functional. It was not designed to glide. It was designed to intrude. It was small, barely larger than a scout vessel, and it rested in the heart of a canyon, its metallic hull gleaming with a harsh, silver light that seemed to push back against the tired, amber sunlight of the Xylan star. It had no insignia, no identifying marks that Kalen could cross-reference with his exhaustive archives. It was an anomaly, a grammatical error in the final, perfect sentence of the universe. A ramp lowered from the strange ship, and a single figure emerged. It was bipedal, encased in a form-fitting suit of some dull gray material. The being moved with a strange energy, a brisk, purposeful stride that seemed entirely out of place in the lethargic to dust-choked atmosphere of Xylos. The figure did not hail him, did not look to the sky, did not seem to acknowledge the silent, watching presence of the winner's elegy at all. Instead, it began to work. It set up devices that Kalen's sensors could not properly analyze. Strange, humming pylons that drove themselves into the desiccated earth. They pulsed with a low, rhythmic thrum, a sound that felt less like a machine and more like a heartbeat, strong and insistent. The being moved between them, adjusting dials, tapping at floating screens of hard, blue light, its movements economical and precise. For days, Kalen watched this strange ritual. The being, which he had designated the intruder, never rested. It simply worked. A solitary gardener in a planetary graveyard. Kalen felt a growing sense of unease, a violation of the sacred peace he was meant to be observing. This was not part of the dignified end of Xylos. This was an interruption. On the fourth day, the change began. It was subtle at first. The fine, red dust that coated everything seemed to settle, the air growing clearer. Kalen's atmospheric sensors registered a minute increase in oxygen, a chemical process that should have ceased on this world long ago. He focused the elegy's magnifiers on the ground near one of the pylons. There, at the base of the humming device, was a patch of moss. It was a deep, vibrant, impossible green. Moss had not grown on Xylos for 50,000 years. It had been one of the first life forms to succumb to the rot, its simple biology no match for the creeping entropy. Yet here it was, alive and spreading. The sight filled Kalen not with wonder, but with a profound, chilling horror. This was not life returning. This was a desecration. It was a crude scrawl over the last page of a masterpiece. He watched, transfixed in revulsion, as the impossible green spread out from the pylons in a rapidly expanding circle. The petrified husks of ancient, native flora began to soften, their brittle gray bark regaining a supple texture, their forms straightening as if drinking in a long-forgotten nourishment. A streambed that had been cracked and dry for an age began to darken with moisture, and then, with a sound that the world had not heard in millennia, a trickle of clear water began to flow. The intruder stood in the center of this creeping rebirth, its helmeted head turning slowly, observing the results of its work with an air of detached satisfaction. It was then that a message, the first communication since its arrival, was transmitted, not just to Kayla, but seemingly to the void itself. It was not in any known galactic language, yet the Elegy's translation matrix, an ancient and powerful thing, deciphered it with ease. The message was simple, composed of only 5 words that would forever shatter the solemn peace of the dying cosmos. Initial diagnostic and reversal successful. Reversal, the word echoed in the sterile confines of Kalen's ship. An obscenity. The rot was not a disease to be reversed. It was the state of being. To reverse it was to reverse time, to reverse causality, to reverse the very nature of existence. Kalen focused his attention on the silent, chitinous cities of the Xylans. He expected to see no change. They were a people who had embraced their end, a culture that had chosen to fade. Their shared consciousness was gone. But his instruments began to register a faint, flickering signal from the heart of the capital. It was weak, fragmented, but it was undeniably the ghost of the Xylan dream song. The intruder was not just reawakening the planet's biology. It was trying to reawaken its dead. This was no longer a violation. This was a form of cosmic necromancy. The horror in Kalen's mind coalesced into a single, terrifying realization. The beings in that ugly silver ship were not explorers. They were not observers. They were physicians. And they had looked upon a universe that had found peace in its dignified end and had diagnosed it as sick. They saw the great rot not as the natural, final state of things, but as a problem to be solved, a malfunction to be corrected. He watched as the green of new life washed over the tired red landscape of Xylos, as the water flowed faster, as the dream song grew infinitesimally stronger, nightmare being dragged back from the peace of the void. The serene silence of the end had been broken. It was replaced by the insistent, aggressive, and utterly terrifying hum of an unwanted dawn, engineered by a force that did not seem to comprehend the sanctity of a good death. A new transmission came from the surface, this time directed at his ship. It was an audio signal, and the translation matrix rendered the voice as calm, level, and filled with a chilling, professional confidence. Unidentified vessel in orbit. This is Dr. Eris Thorne of the Human Vessel Remedy. We have stabilized the entropic decay cascade on this world. The indigenous population will require careful rehabilitation, but we project a full recovery of their civilization within 3 standard cycles. You may have noticed we've taken the liberty of reinforcing the local star's fusion cycle as well. It was getting dangerously anemic. Please identify yourselves. You are here to help. Help. Word was a threat. Kalen, the final archivist, whose entire existence was dedicated to honoring the final chapter, now faced the one thing he had never prepared for. The one thing his vast archives had never conceived of: a creature who had arrived at the end of the book and had decided to start writing new pages. The universe was no longer dying. It was being treated. And Kalen felt a cold, primal fear spread through him, a fear far deeper than any fear of oblivion. It was the fear of a cure that promised to be infinitely more terrifying than the disease. For a long moment that stretched into an eternity, Kalen did not move. The voice of the human, Eris Thorne, echoed in the sterile chamber of his mind. The words themselves simple, but their implication a cataclysm. Help. The term was an obscenity in the context of the Great Rot. One did not help a symphony reach its final, fading chord. One did not help a masterwork of poetry complete its last, perfect line. One witnessed, one honored. The human concept of help, as demonstrated on the violated world below, was akin to a physician applying defibrillators to a corpse that had already found its peace. It was a violent, selfish act, born of an inability to accept the universe's most fundamental truth: all things must end. His duty, however, was absolute. He was an archivist, and this unprecedented, horrifying event was now the most important entry he would ever make. To flee would be to fail not only his purpose, but the memory of every world he had ever chronicled. Steeling himself, his slender, light-woven fingers activated the communication suite. He would not use a visual channel. He did not wish to see the face of the being who spoke of reigniting stars as if it were routine maintenance. Nor did he wish for it to see his own form, which he knew would radiate a cold, silent fury. He opened a narrow audio frequency, his own voice synthesized by the elegy into a series of soft, resonant chimes that the universal translator would render into comprehensible speech. This is Archivist Kalen of the Signian Compact, aboard the vessel Winner's Elegy. Your actions on the planet below are noted. He chose the word carefully. It was the language of his profession, neutral and observant, but he hoped it carried a fraction of the profound disapproval he felt. The human's response was immediate, devoid of the cautious pauses that usually preceded interspecies communication. Archivist Kalen, a pleasure to make your acquaintance. Signian Compact. Our historical databases have a file on you. Ancient, highly philosophical, adopted a policy of passive observation approximately 3 million cycles ago in response to the Great Rot, as your literature calls it. A fascinating societal response to systemic decay. Pathological, of course, but fascinating. The clinical condescension in the human's tone was like a physical blow. He had reduced an entire civilization's deeply considered philosophy, their ultimate understanding of existence, to a pathological response. Kalen felt a surge of something hot and sharp, an emotion his people had largely bred out of themselves over the eons. Anger is not a response, Dr. Thorne. It is an acceptance, an understanding that the universe has a rhythm. And this is its final movement. The species on that world, the Xylans, had made their peace. They had chosen to cease their dream and embrace the silence. What you have done is not a rescue. It is a violation of a sacred finality. There was a soft sound from the human's end, a brief exhalation of air that the translator identified as a chuckle. It was a dry, dismissive sound. With all due respect, Archivist, your perspective is a symptom of the disease itself. We've encountered it before. Civilizations that lose the will to fight, that romanticize their own extinction. They compose elegies to entropy. We write prescriptions. The Xylans didn't choose to cease dreaming. Their collective neural network was failing due to cascading energy deficits in their planet's biosphere. We simply restored the system to optimal functionality. They'll be confused for a time, certainly. Waking up is always disorienting, but they will live. As if to punctuate the human's words, Kalen's long-range sensors screamed a new alert. The star, the tired amber sun of Xylos, was changing. The soft, gentle light that had bathed the world in a perpetual twilight was sharpening, intensifying. The color was shifting, climbing the spectrum from red to a harsh, unforgiving yellow-white. On the surface below, the newly formed streams began to steam. the impossible green moss turning a paler shade under the unexpected ferocity of the new light. The shadows, once long and soft, became stark and black, like fresh wounds cut into the landscape. The revitalized world looked terrified. It cowered under a sun it no longer recognized. "You have reinforced the star," Kalen chimed, his voice colder than the void between worlds. "You speak of it as if you were patching a leaking pipe." "A crude analogy, but not inaccurate," Thorn replied, his voice still radiating that unbearable, cheerful confidence. It was a simple matter of recalibrating the helium to hydrogen fusion ratio in reinforcing the star's magnetic containment field. It was scheduled to extinguish in another 1,000 years. Now, it's stable for at least another 5 million. You can't have a functioning biosphere without a reliable power source. After all, it's just basic engineering. Basic engineering. He spoke of unraveling the very fabric of celestial mechanics, of defying the slow, dignified death of a star, with the casual air of a maintenance technician. Kalen turned his attention back to the planet. The dream song of the Xylans, which had been a faint, ghostly hum, was now a rising cacophony. The elegy's empathic sensors, designed to gently interpret the final emotional states of a dying species, were now overloaded with a torrent of raw, unprocessed data. The translator struggled to assign words to the chaos. Confusion, pain, fear. Where is the quiet? Why is it so loud? The light, it burns. We were finished. We were complete. Why have we been torn back? The dream was no longer a shared consciousness. It was a collective nightmare. The Xylans were not waking up. They were being tortured, their peaceful oblivion ripped away to be replaced by a loud, bright, agonizing reality they had not asked for. "They are in agony," Kalen stated, the chimes of his voice losing their melodic quality, becoming flat and hard. "You have not saved them. You have resurrected them into a hell of your own making." "It's called withdrawal, archivist," Thorn said, his tone shifting slightly, taking on the patient air of a doctor explaining a complex procedure to a frightened child. "Their systems have been in a state of decay for so long that the sudden return to full function is a shock. It's a necessary part of the healing process. Pain is often a precursor to recovery. To us, the absence of struggle is the true definition of death. Stagnation is the enemy, not oblivion." Kalen felt the conceptual gulf between them widen into an uncrossable chasm. To the Cygnian Compact, and to every elder race he knew, the struggle had ended long ago. Peace was found in the cessation of that struggle. To this human, the struggle was life itself. The absence of it was a malady. They were a species that had looked at a calm sea and seen not tranquility, but a lack of progress. They were a people who would throw stones into a silent pond just to watch the ripples, unable to appreciate the beauty of the undisturbed surface. A horrifying thought began to form in Kalen's mind, a question that he was almost too afraid to ask. "Dr. Thorn, this vessel, the remedy, is Xylos your first patient?" The human paused for the first time, a brief 2-second delay that felt more ominous than any of his quick replies. "Oh, no, not by a long shot. We're just one unit in the fleet. The Great Rot, as you call it, is a galaxy-wide pandemic. We've been mapping its progression for decades. My specific team was assigned to this quadrant. My colleagues in the Perseus arm just finished reseeding a cluster of worlds whose biospheres had gone fallow, and I believe the engineering core is currently working on a project to stabilize the accretion disk of the galactic core's primary black hole. The energy bleed off from its hawking radiation was causing gravitational instabilities in the surrounding spiral arms. It's a big job, but someone has to do it. Kalen felt the structure of his reality dissolve. He had spent his long existence traveling a dying universe, carefully, lovingly recording the final verses of its epic poem. He also learned that a frantic, unseen editor was rushing ahead of him, scribbling over the final pages, refusing to let the story end. They were not just treating a planet. They were not just reigniting a star. They were trying to fix the entire galaxy. They were waging a war against the fundamental nature of time and space. They were fighting entropy itself. He thought of the Void Singers, whose final, fading song he had so carefully transcribed. Would a human ship one day arrive and force air back into their atrophied lungs, compelling them to sing again against their will? He thought it of the crystalline forests of Alaris Prime. Were human engineers at this very moment shattering the beautiful, petrified trees to plant seeds for new, aggressive flora that would tear through the sacred ground? The scope of their arrogance was breathtaking. It was a cosmic madness, a pathological refusal to let go. And he, the archivist, was now the chronicler of a new and terrible age, not the age of twilight, but the age of unwanted light. "You cannot do this," Kalen whispered, the words as soft as a desperate chime. "The universe has earned its rest." "Rest is what you do when the work is done," Eris Thorn replied, and the simple sincerity in his voice was the most terrifying thing Kalen had ever heard. "And our work has just begun. We found that the primary vector for the entropic decay isn't a physical law, but a mimetic one, a sort of informational virus, a pervasive sense of despair that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Your compact is a prime example. The most effective treatment isn't just physical, but psychological. We have to remind the galaxy what it feels like to have hope. Hope." To Kalen, that word now sounded like a declaration of war. He knew then that his mission had changed. He could no longer be a passive observer. To witness this desecration in silence would be to condone it. The other elder races, slumbering in their archives and monasteries, content in their acceptance of the end, they had to be warned. They had to be told that a force had arrived in the galaxy that saw their peace as a sickness, their acceptance as a weakness, and their dignified end as a problem to be solved with brute, unrelenting force. The quiet, melancholic task of the archivist was over. A new, desperate role was being forced upon him, that of a herald. A Cassandra screaming a warning against a future no one could have possibly imagined. "Your presence here is logged, Doctor," Kalen said, his voice now devoid of any emotion, a flat, hard surface. "I have all the data I require." He did not wait for a reply. He severed the communication link, the sudden silence in the elegy a blessed relief. His many-jointed fingers flew across the navigation console, plotting a course away from this violated system, away from the harsh, clinical light of its tortured star. He had to run, not for his own safety, but for the sake of the truth. He cast one final look at the image of Xylos on his main screen. It was a world of screaming color, a violent rebirth, a planetary canvas that had been painted over by a mad artist. It was alive, yes, but its soul had been murdered. As the winter's elegy silently turned its back on the world and its human saviors, Kalen felt the profound weight of his new purpose settle upon him. He was no longer a curator of beautiful endings. He was now the sole witness to the beginning of a terrible, endless, and manufactured dawn. And he had to tell the others. He had to tell them that the long, quiet night was being canceled, and that the physicians were coming for them all. The journey from the Xylos system was a flight through a graveyard Kalen had once called his home. Every nebula, a celestial tombstone of breathtaking beauty, now seemed to hold a latent threat. Every cooling star, a patient on a deathbed he now feared would be stormed by aggressive physicians. The silence of the void, once a comforting and final truth, now felt like the held breath before a scream. The human's words, "Our work has just begun," had infected him. He saw their influence everywhere, a potential desecration lurking behind every celestial body. He was no longer the archivist, a serene witness to a natural process. He was a fugitive, carrying a warning that felt like a poison in his own mind. His destination was the only place that mattered, the nexus of what remained of the great elder civilizations, Hesiod, the seat of the silent conclave. Hesiod was not a planet of towering cities or grand monuments. Its surface was a single, unbroken expanse of black, glassy obsidian, polished by eons of solar winds. The conclave did not meet on the surface, but within it. The chamber was a perfect sphere carved into the planet's core, accessible only by a single resonance-tuned transport tube. It was a place of absolute quiet, where the only sound was the faint, internal hum of ancient beings deep in contemplation. Here, representatives of the galaxy's most ancient races gathered not to rule or to command, but to agree. Their purpose for millennia had been to ensure the process of the Great Rot was dignified, that no civilization's end was unduly violent or disruptive to the final peace of its neighbors. They were the galaxy's designated executors, and that they performed their duties with a somber, detached grace. When the winter's elegy arrived, its presence was a disruption, a sharp note in a chord that had been held for 1,000,000 years. Kalen bypassed the usual protocols, his entry request coded with a level of urgency the conclave had not seen since the collapse of the Andromeda Bridge. He was granted an immediate audience. He stood alone in the center of the vast spherical chambers. The representatives were arrayed along the walls, their forms indistinct in the low, internal light of the planet's core. There was a being of pure, crystalline geometry, a swirling cloud of sentient gas, a silent monolith that communicated in shifts of gravity, and Lyra, the speaker for the conclave, a being much like Kalen himself, composed of light and bone, but older, her form more stable, her light a softer, more settled silver. Archivist Kalen. Lyra's chiming voice echoed in the perfect acoustics of the chamber. Your summons was insistent. You bring a new ending to be recorded. Her tone was calm, patient, the voice of one who has witnessed the decay of galaxies and is not easily surprised. I bring a report of an ending that has been denied, Kalen began, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. He recounted his vigil over Xylos, his voice steady as he described the arrival of the ugly silver ship. He detailed the devices, the impossible green moss, the water flowing in dry riverbeds. The conclave listened in absolute silence, their stillness a form of profound attention. He could feel their skepticism, a gentle pressure in the air. They were hearing the testimony of a disturbed mind. An anomaly, perhaps, a localized, unexplained phenomenon. And you have verified this energy signature, a gravitational pulse emanated from the monolith. It is not a previously uncatalogued form of stellar rejuvenation. It was not the star, Kalen stated flatly. It was the vessel. It was the being. It was Lyra who voiced the chamber's collective disbelief. Kalen, you are the most respected of all our archivists. Your records are masterpieces of clarity and objectivity, but what you are describing, reversing the rot, is a logical impossibility. It is like suggesting one could reverse a memory or unspeak a word. It defies the fundamental nature of causality. Then I will let the impossibility speak for itself, Kalen said. He raised one slender arm, and the center of the chamber, filled with a holographic projection, was the audio file of his conversation with the human, Eris Thorn. The human's voice, filtered through the elegy's translator, filled the sacred silence of the conclave. It was casual, confident, and utterly alien. When Thorn spoke of the Signian philosophy as a pathological response, a flicker of agitation ran through Lyra's silver form. When he called reigniting the Xylan star basic engineering, the crystalline being seemed to dim, as if in shock. When it was the recording of the Xylan dream song that broke their composure, Kalen played the empathic data stream, the raw, translated agony of a people dragged back from their peaceful oblivion. The chamber was filled with the psychic scream of a billion minds in torment. The light, it burns. The silence is broken. We were complete. The swirling gas being contracted violently, and the monolith emitted a low, sorrowful gravitational wave that made the obsidian walls tremble. The sound was an obscenity in this holy place. It was the sound of a piece being murdered. He called it withdrawal, Kalen said into the horrified silence. A necessary pain. And he claimed they are not alone. He spoke of a fleet, of projects in other galactic arms, of stabilizing the galactic core. For the first time in known history, the silent conclave was no longer silent. A cacophony of dismay erupted. A dozen different forms of communication light pulses, gravitic shifts, psychic whispers, all expressing the same profound horror. They had spent millions of years composing a universal eulogy, and a race of cosmic vandals had arrived to scribble in the margins. This cannot be, Lyra chimed, her own voice losing its serene quality. One ship, one rogue species with a dangerously misunderstood technology, though perhaps. But a fleet waging war against entropy itself. It is the philosophy of a child who cannot understand that a game must end. Even as she spoke, a new signal was being routed to the conclave's primary sensorium. It came from the Perseus Arm, a sector that had been dark for 200,000 years. An elder race there, the Lumina, beings of stable energy, had been monitoring the final cooling of their native star cluster. Their report was brief and panicked. Half a dozen stars in the cluster, stars that should have been entering their final red dwarf phase, were inexplicably brightening. They were shifting back up the main sequence, their light turning from a gentle crimson to a harsh, aggressive blue-white. The Lumina, who had spent 100 millennia adjusting their forms to the growing darkness, were now being blinded by an unwanted, agonizing light. Their report ended with a single, terrified question. Who is doing this? Before the conclave could even process this new information, another report came in, and another. A dormant network of navigational buoys in a long-dead trade sector had suddenly reactivated, broadcasting a patterned signal that was not their own. A planet of silicon-based life, which had embraced its final crystallization, was showing signs of geological instability, its beautiful static crust cracking under some new internal pressure. It was happening everywhere. Kalen had not witnessed an anomaly. He had witnessed the first wave of an invasion of life, an invasion of hope. The debate in the chamber became frantic, desperate. What could be done? They had no armies. Their ships were designed for observation and quiet passage, not for conflict. The very concept of a weapon had been archaic to them for longer than humanity had existed as a species. How could they fight an enemy they could not comprehend? How could they resist a force whose stated goal was to save them? It was in the midst of this helpless chaos that the ultimate violation occurred. A new signal pierced the layers of security and protocol that shielded the conclave. It was not a request for communication. It was a broadcast, appearing simultaneously on every internal display in the chamber. It was a wide-band, galaxy-spanning message sent from a source that moved with impossible speed, blanketing every known civilization. A face appeared. It was the face of a human, though not the one Kaylin had spoken to. This one was female, her features sharp, her eyes a piercing, intelligent blue. She stood before a backdrop that showed a swirling map of the galaxy, dotted with points of flaring light. Her expression was one of profound, earnest sincerity. "Greetings to the established civilizations of this galaxy," she began, her voice calm and filled with a warmth that was more chilling than any threat. "I am Director Ilara Vance of the Galactic Revitalization Project. For too long, you have suffered under the effects of the systemic decay we have designated entropic cascade failure. Many of you have lost the will to fight, accepting this decline as inevitable. We are here to tell you that it is not. Hope is not lost. Your story is not over." The camera pulled back to show other humans at consoles behind her, all working with a quiet, focused intensity. "Our advanced teams, like the one you may have encountered from the Remedy, are already deployed and have had remarkable success in reversing local decay events. Now, we begin the next phase. This is not a takeover. This is a partnership. We bring with us the science of renewal, the technology of rebirth. We will help you rebuild your worlds, reignite your stars, and reclaim the vibrant future you thought you had lost. We ask only for your cooperation. A new dawn is coming to this galaxy. Let us embrace it. Together." The message ended, leaving a stunned, absolute silence in its wake. The human's smiling face was replaced by a logo, a stylized starburst cradled in a pair of open hands. It was an emblem of creation, of giving. It was the most terrifying symbol Kaylin had ever seen. The silent conclave of Hesiod, the wisest and most ancient beings in the known universe, stared at the empty screen. They had spent millions of years preparing themselves for the dignified end of all things, but they were utterly, completely, and hopelessly unprepared for an enemy that had declared war on death itself, an enemy who promised not conquest or destruction, but a new and terrible beginning. The broadcast from Director Vance was more devastating to the conclave than any declaration of war could have been. A threat can be met with defiance, an attack with defense. But how do you resist an offer of salvation? How do you fight a physician who insists you are sick and promises a cure, especially when they begin administering that cure without your consent? The galaxy-wide message shattered the conclave's horrified disbelief and replaced it with a cold, paralyzing dread. The humans weren't just a rogue element. They were an organized, galaxy-spanning project with a clear, terrifying mission statement. They were not invaders. They were missionaries, and their gospel was hope. A gospel the elder races had long ago deemed a heresy. In the days that followed, Hesiod became a nexus of panicked communication. The reports Kaylin had preempted became a flood. Species that had been silent for eons reached out, their messages a mixture of confusion and fear. The Methuselah, a race of silicon-based life forms who had achieved a state of perfect, contemplative stillness within their crystalline home world, reported that human terraforming engines were now drilling into their planet's crust, injecting geothermal catalyst to re-liquefy the core and restart volcanic activity. The human engineers had left them a message explaining that a geologically stagnant world was unhealthy. The Methuselah were not being attacked. They were being saved from the sin of stillness. The Void Singers, whose final fading hymns were meant to be the last sound they ever made, sent a frantic message that a human vessel was now broadcasting a cacophony of uplifting and motivational harmonies into their nebula, designed to counteract the mimetic effects of their depressive musical tradition. The humans were not silencing their song. They were trying to teach them a new one, a happier one, whether they wanted to learn it or not. The silent conclave was no longer silent. It was a chamber of endless, helpless debate. The core of their philosophy, the acceptance of the great rot, was being systematically dismantled, not by force, but by a relentless, cheerful campaign of galactic wellness. Lyra, the speaker, her silver light flickering with uncharacteristic agitation, tried to frame a response. "We must contact them," she chimed, her voice resonating with a desperate urgency. "We must make them understand. Our acceptance is not a symptom. It is a choice. Wisdom earned over a span of time they cannot possibly comprehend. They are children playing with the master controls of the universe, convinced they are fixing a machine they don't even understand." Kaylin, who had been listening to the frantic reports with a growing sense of grim validation, stepped forward. "They will not understand," he said, his voice flat. "I spoke to one of them. Their understanding is a diagnosis. To them, your wisdom is a pathology. Your peace is a disease. You cannot reason with a physician who believes his patient is delusional. He will simply dismiss your arguments as further proof of the illness. Then what do you propose?" "Archivist." A gravitational pulse from the monolith rumbled. "We have no weapons. We have no fleets. The concept of organized resistance is as alien to us as their concept of perpetual struggle is to them. We must find a weakness," Kaylin stated, the words tasting strange and bitter in his mind. He was an observer, a poet of endings. Now he was forced to think like a strategist, a role for which he had no training, and a deep, philosophical revulsion. They are not gods. They are a biological species. They must have a vulnerability. They are treating the galaxy. But what is their own health? Where do they come from? What drives this pathological need to fix everything? The idea was so foreign to the conclave's way of thinking that a hush fell over the chamber. They did not pry into the origins of other species. They did not seek out vulnerabilities. They honored and they recorded. Kaylin was proposing espionage. He was proposing a form of intellectual warfare. Lyra considered his words, her silver light pulsing slowly. Their home system, they call it Sol. It is in a relatively young and unremarkable sector of the galaxy. Our archives have a basic entry on it, compiled by an automated probe millions of years ago. It was noted as having a single life-bearing planet. Nothing more. "Then that is where we must look," Kaylin insisted. "They are broadcasting their message of renewal across the entire galaxy. But what message are they not sending? What are they hiding? A physician who preaches health so loudly may be trying to conceal a sickness of his own." The decision was made, not with enthusiasm, but with the grim resignation of a patient consenting to a painful, invasive surgery. They had no other choice. Kaylin, as the one who had made first contact and who now understood the human mindset better than any of them, was tasked with the mission. The Winter's Elegy was not a vessel of stealth, but the Conclave still possessed technology far beyond what the humans could likely detect. They augmented the ship systems, weaving cloaking fields that bent not just light and energy, but causality itself, making the ship a ghost in spacetime, an event that had almost, but not quite, happened. His journey to the Sol system was a journey into the heart of the disease he sought to understand. He passed through systems where human revitalization was in full swing. He saw stars burning with a violent, unnatural blue light. Their planets, once quiet and settled, now racked by forced atmospheric changes and aggressive, newly introduced ecosystems. He saw fleets of the same ugly, functional human ships moving with a relentless purpose, their transmissions filled with technical jargon about biosphere recalibration, entropic reversal percentages, and societal morale metrics. They were treating the galaxy like a single, massive patient, and they were utterly confident in their methods. As he neared the Sol system, the human presence grew denser. This was clearly their staging ground, a hub of activity from which their galactic crusade was launched. Fleets of Remedy-class vessels moved in orderly lanes, and massive construction platforms hung in space, assembling new ships at a startling rate. But as he drew closer to their home world, the third planet from the star, he noticed something strange. A quarantine, a heavily enforced exclusion zone, surrounded the planet, patrolled by automated warships that were far more heavily armed than the medical vessels he had seen elsewhere. No ships were allowed to enter or leave without a complex and rigorous decontamination protocol. It was a stark contradiction. The saviors of the galaxy, the bringers of life and renewal, had quarantined their own cradle. Hiding within his causality cloak, Kalen slipped the Winter's Elegy through the quarantine field. What he saw on his sensors made his 3 hearts beat with a cold, slow dread. The planet, which their ancient probes had labeled Earth, was dying. And it was not dying with the slow, dignified grace of the Great Rot. It was a world in its death throes, a body riddled with a violent, raging cancer. The atmosphere was a toxic, brown shroud, thick with industrial poisons and radioactive isotopes. The oceans were black, slick with chemical sludge, their surfaces choked with vast, floating continents of synthetic waste. The land masses were scarred, pitted with the remains of ancient wars. Vast swaths of the surface fused into radioactive glass. There were cities, but they were not the vibrant centers of a thriving civilization. They were gargantuan, sealed biodomes, hermetic bubbles of recycled air and artificial light, clinging to the surface like parasites on a decaying corpse. And even from orbit, Kalen's empathic sensors could detect the state of the beings within a pervasive, soul-deep despair, a cultural agony that made the manufactured pain of the Xylans seem trivial. This was humanity's secret. This was the sickness the physicians were hiding. They hadn't conquered entropy, they had simply outrun it. They had poisoned their own world, murdered their own biosphere, and in a final, desperate act of survival, they had abandoned it. They had turned their formidable intellect and relentless drive outward, not to explore, but to escape. Their quest to revitalize the galaxy was not an act of altruism. It was a frantic search for a new home, for raw materials, for a place to start over. But they were not just settlers. They were a virus, carrying the memory of their self-inflicted plague. They saw sickness in the quiet peace of the elder races because they themselves had never known anything but a frantic, violent struggle against the death they had created. The Great Rot was a slow, natural end. What had happened to Earth was a suicide. Kalen drifted in the poisoned orbit of this dead world, the truth of his discovery settling upon him like a shroud of lead. He now understood the human obsession with fixing things. It was a desperate projection of their own failure. They couldn't fix their own home, so they had turned their frantic, obsessive energy upon the galaxy, determined to save it from a fate they had already inflicted upon themselves. They were trying to cure the universe of a disease that only they carried. He focused his sensors on one of the larger biodomes. Within it, he saw the humans. They lived in sterile corridors, their food grown in nutrient vats, their sunlight a pale imitation projected on the ceiling. They were surrounded by the wonders of their own technology, yet they were prisoners in a tomb of their own making. And then he saw their archives, their history. He saw the wars they had waged upon themselves, the poisons they had poured into their own oceans, the relentless consumption that had devoured their world. It was a history of struggle, yes, but not a noble struggle against a dying universe. It was a petty, savage, and ultimately self-destructive struggle of brother against brother, of greed against reason. He had found their weakness. It was not a weapon or a technological flaw. It was a hypocrisy. It was a lie of cosmic proportions. The saviors of the galaxy were the authors of their own apocalypse. They offered a cure for a disease they were still actively spreading. With a heavy heart, Kalen recorded it all: the dead oceans, the toxic air, the self-imposed prisons, the hidden history of self-destruction. He had come seeking a vulnerability, and he had found a tragedy. He turned the winter's elegy around, slipping back through the quarantine field like a phantom. He now carried a truth far more powerful than any weapon. He would return to the Conclave not with a plan for war, but with a story. The story of a species so terrified of its own reflection that it had decided to repaint the entire universe in its own image, rather than face the monster it had become. The question now was, what would the galaxy do when it learned that its new physicians were themselves the plague? The return of the winter's elegy to Hesiod was not a triumphant arrival, but the slow, heavy docking of a hearse carrying the body of a terrible truth. Kalen felt the weight of his discovery as a physical pressure, a density that seemed to settle in the very bones of his ship. When he stood once more in the center of the silent conclave's core chamber, the atmosphere was different. The panicked energy had subsided, replaced by a deep, expectant quiet, the silence of a people awaiting a final diagnosis. He did not speak at first. He simply raised his arm and let the archives of Earth fill the void. The conclave bore witness to a death they had never conceived of. Not the gentle fading of the great rot, but a violent, self-inflicted exsanguination. They saw the images Kalen had recorded: the curdled brown sky, the oceans gleaming with black poison, the skeletal remains of forests petrified by acid rain. They watched humanity's own historical logs, fragments Kalen had pulled from their unshielded deep net, a frantic montage of mushroom clouds, of cities choking in their own smog, of leaders promising growth and progress as their world withered around them. They saw the final, desperate retreat into the hermetically sealed domes, a species imprisoning itself to escape the consequences of its own rapaciousness. The agony of the Xylans had horrified the conclave, but this was a different kind of horror. This was not the tragedy of a peace being violated. It was the obscene spectacle of a murderer preaching sanctity. When the final image of a skeletal human child in a famine-racked city faded from the air, a profound, soul-shaking stillness filled the chamber. It was the silence of understanding. The humans were not arrogant children playing with forces they did not comprehend. They were escapees from a hell of their own creation, and they were trying to rebuild their lost Eden by bulldozing the quiet gardens of a universe that had already made its peace with the twilight. Lyra's silver light was dim, her voice a fragile chime that barely disturbed the air. "They are not physicians," she whispered. "They are ghosts, haunting the galaxy with the memory of a world they killed." The path forward was now terribly, unavoidably clear. They could not fight the humans with force, but they could fight them with the one thing they seemed to fear most: their own reflection. The conclave, a body that had not acted in 1,000,000 years, acted, They harnessed the ancient communication network that bound their silent worlds, a system that operated on principles of quantum entanglement far more advanced than humanity's crude broadcast methods. They took Kalen's entire report, the images, the history, the damning contrast between the vibrant, healthy galaxy humanity claimed to be saving and the festering tomb they had left behind, and they sent it out. They did not editorialize. They did not condemn. They simply titled the broadcast "The Physician's Sickness" and let the truth speak for itself. The effect was not immediate, but it was profound. The message rippled through the civilizations humanity was treating. On worlds where human ships were teaching motivational songs, the natives fell silent, the cheerful melodies now sounding like the ravings of the mad. The Methuselah, using the geothermal drills the humans had so generously provided, sealed the boreholes and began to methodically reinforce the crystalline crust of their world, turning their home into a fortress against their would-be saviors. Species that had been on the verge of accepting human aid now politely but firmly declined. The Great Schism had begun. The galaxy was no longer united in a peaceful acceptance of the end. It was now fractured, divided between those who saw the humans as a plague and a small, desperate minority of younger races who, fearing oblivion, were still willing to take the offered cure, even knowing the sickness of the physician. The human response was swift and precisely what Kalen had predicted. They did not retreat. They did not apologize. They escalated. A fleet of human vessels, larger and more advanced than any Kalen had yet seen, appeared in orbit around Hesiod. There was no bombardment, no show of force. They simply sat in the blackness, a silent ring of judgment. Then a single vessel detached itself and descended, its brutal, functional design an insult to the perfect obsidian sphere of the planet. It landed on the glassy surface, and a single figure emerged, Director Ilara Vance. She had come to treat the heart of the infection herself. She was granted an audience. She walked into the core chamber, her form encased in a crisp, white uniform, her expression not one of anger, but of deep, profound disappointment, the look of a doctor whose patient refuses to take their life-saving medicine. She stood in the center of the chamber, her gaze sweeping over the ancient, silent forms arrayed against the walls, finally settling on Lyra and Kalen, who stood beside her. "We know what you have done," she said, her voice calm, reasonable, yet carrying an edge of cold steel. "You have taken our private tragedy and weaponized it. You have spread fear and mistrust, undoing months of progress, all because you lacked the courage to embrace a future you did not write yourselves." Lyra's light pulsed gently. "We have shown the galaxy the truth. Your project is not born of altruism, but of a desperate flight from your own failure. You do not heal. You replace. You pave over what you do not understand." Director Vance gave a small-eyed, sad smile. "You see failure. We see a lesson paid for with the price of our own world. Yes, we destroyed our home. We were young, foolish, and self-destructive. We pushed our world to the brink, and we stared into the abyss of our own extinction. And that is precisely why we are the only ones qualified for this task." Her eyes burned with a terrifying, absolute conviction. "You ancient races have known nothing but slow, gentle decline. You speak of the dignity of death, but you know nothing of the true, ugly face of it. We do. We have tasted the ash of our own world. We have choked on the poison of our own progress. Our suffering is our credential. We are not trying to save you from the great rot, a fate you seem so eager to embrace. We are saving you from us. We are saving you from the mistakes we made, the ones you are too stagnant and too complacent to even imagine. We will not allow another world to die the way ours did. Not by our hand, and not by yours. And in that moment, Kalen understood the final, impossible truth. The humans were incurable. Their hypocrisy was not a weakness. It was their shield. Their guilt was not a burden. It was the engine of their crusade. They had weaponized their own tragedy into a justification for universal intervention. They could not be reasoned with because their entire civilization was now a testament to the failure of reason. They could not be stopped because they were running from a memory so horrific that any action, no matter how invasive or destructive, seemed preferable to standing still. Director Vance turned to leave. "The revitalization project will continue," she said, her back to them. "We will deal with the resistance your propaganda has created. We had hoped for a partnership, but if you insist on clinging to your sickness, you will simply have to administer the cure more forcefully. For your own good, of course." The human shuttle ascended, and the fleet in orbit did not leave. It remained, a permanent quarantine around the world that dared to speak the truth, a sterile barrier between the physicians and the patient who refused to be healed. The war had begun, but it would not be a war of weapons. It would be a war of ideas, of will, of hope against acceptance. Kalen returned to the observation deck of the Winter's Elegy, looking out not at a dying star, but at the cold, hard light of the human warships. His life's work was over. The great, slow, dignified end he had so lovingly chronicled had been canceled. The final page had been torn out, and a new, chaotic, and violent story was being written. He had set out to record the end of the universe, and in his attempt to protect it, he had ensured it would never find that peace. He had wanted to preserve the sanctity of the final silence, but he had only succeeded in amplifying the noise. With a sense of profound and ultimate irony, he raised his slender, light-woven hand and materialized his holographic slate. The old archive, the chronicles of the Great Rot, dissolved into nothingness. He began a new one. The first entry was simple, his precise, elegant script forming the words that would define the rest of existence. The age of silence is over. The human age has begun. They have brought the galaxy a terrible gift, an endless, agonizing life, and I, the last archivist of endings, must now become the first historian of a future that will never be allowed to end. The universe was no longer dying. It was screaming, and Kalen, for the first time, began to write it all down.